Hello, my name is Ross Studd, and I'm the technical person on Repair What You Wear, which is a website giving free tutorials for how to mend clothing, but also educational information on textiles. And in social media, we try and influence people to change their behavior towards clothing, to be aware that clothing has an environmental impact and why it has an environmental impact, then what you can do about it, which is predominantly to reduce consumption and wear longer. This is a recording of a class we've given quite a few times, which is how to teach core mending skills. It's a system we've developed that's quite simplified, and it's the start of the mending journey. If people don't really get taught well from the beginning, then they're not adaptable in their skills. We hope you get something out of this, but before we start, I want to show you what's available on the website. I'll share the screen. Go back to the beginning. Right, so this is our website, and we are going to look at core mending skills. Before we do that, if you happen to be in education or you want to get yourself a bit more, you want to refresh your knowledge on fabrics and fibre skills, then nip down to our educational resources, which is a project that goes into any of the UK curriculums. You're welcome to use any of it. It's all based on adapting an existing garment and exploring and creating textiles. So it's not about making a beautiful finished object with a sewing machine. It's about an investigative journey based on fashion, fabrics, and the environment, and hopefully one day will be mandatory. We can live in hope. So we've done a few things here. I've written on these various core fibers. Polyester and cellulosic fibers are synthetics, which are 60% of clothing. Actually, hang on. Synthetic fibers made of original plastic synthetics is 60%, but cellulosic, which is things like viscose and modal, that's 8% of clothing and rising. And that's a big environmental problem, actually. Wool fibers, this is just because I love wool. Wool is a very underrated fibre, and that's only 1% at the moment, but should be growing, particularly if we need to keep warm. And cotton fibres are 24%. So these are the big players. Bamboo, which people talk about, will be under cellulosic fibres, growing, but very, very small. So then there's some videos we've done on different fibres and also on different constructions. So that when you're teaching, you talk about these different constructions, then people feel they know more about your area, and it'll inform them about their purchasing, and it will also help them understand how to mend these clothes as their skills grow. So let's head back to the repair skills. On our website, you go to Mending Tutorials, Core Mends, and this is what it comes up with. Threading a needle, sewing on buttons, mending a seam as backstitch, mending a hem, herringbone, and ladder stitch. And that's what we're going to look at today. These are all taught left and right-handed and will be there to support your teaching. Now, I'm going to take you on to the practical side of this course. To do that, I'm going to use my hands and use a camera. I'll come back to you at the end. Welcome to How to Teach Core Mending Skills. Looks like something dull, I think, but so many people learn a lot and have a little bit to show for it. It reminds them. We also like to give them out instructions. There's right-handed and left-handed instructions, which cover everything that they've learned. So it's called supportive learning, really, and it's also augmented learning. Calico is a very good material to work on. It's cheap, it's robust, and it's woven. You will know about woven and knitted cloths, but other people might not. And the more aware they become, the better they are at understanding their clothing and how to repair it, but also how to buy. So we know that the warp is the vertical and the weft is the horizontal, weft left. And you can, if you want to, take the time to show people how there's absolutely no elasticity there. or very little elasticity. And the stretch is on the bias. And why is that important? It's important because if you don't have a stretchy seam, then you can use a non-stretchy stitch. But also, woven fabrics come in lots of different ways, and people might not recognise them. We're used to jeans being woven, and they may stretch vertically a little bit and horizontally a lot, but that's because of the presence of elastane. So you can have the conversation about what happens when cotton and synthetics like that are used together. Ultimately, cotton rots and the synthetic doesn't start to rot for 200 to 500 years. Woven cloth can be very exciting too. There's lots of possibility of designs with woven cloth. And because of the structure, it can be quite stretchy. Cotton can also be quite cheaply made. This is a very common brushed cotton twill and may not be hugely robust because the fibres themselves are quite loose and they're woven quite loosely, quite cheap to manufacture. If you have time, this is a good thing to talk about. Knit as well. Knit is where one continuous yarn is in the construction of the fabric, and that means that it stretches whichever way. Knit can be thick or knit can be t-shirts. T-shirts stretch always. Therefore, when you sew the seams, I don't think I can find a seam in this one. This is my scrap one. Oh yeah, look, it's got some good holes in it. It needs to be able to stretch on the seam. And that is why the core seam stitch we teach is backstitch, because it can be used both for the woven cloth and the stretchy knitted cloth. What materials are we using on this course? Well, first of all, you need some needles. I think hemline needles, the Assorted Household, are a good buy. They seem to be better quality. But when we were doing a course during COP, we bought from John James, and I bought these sharps. They're UK made and they are beautiful. So there was no question of the students not being able to thread a decent needle. Sometimes you find with cheap needles that the eye is blocked. Threads. You want a nice contrast thread. You don't really want cheap threads. I've had lots of feedback from buying cheap threads at one point. These sorts of things look good, but they have got a lot of loose fibres in them, and it makes it difficult to thread, puts people off. So get the nicely tightly woven, properly polyester, leftover from sewing project threads. Beg off friends. Also, you want to have some leftover embroidery thread, and this is for you. So take 3 strands off this thread, and that's what you demonstrate with. You want everyone to have 2 cuts of calico, and this is roughly, doesn't matter, but roughly 22 centimetres by 24 or 26 centimetres long. Why calico? Calico's cheap, calico's firm, and you don't feel scared when you're working in calico. Other materials can run away with you, or the needle is too difficult to get the needle in. Sheets are a disaster. I had very bad classes with sheets because the needles were too thick for the sheet, didn't work very well. I like my students to have snips, and sometimes buy BBB snips, which are fully metal, in bulk, and just sell them on for a quid or 2. You need to have pens of some sort for writing on the calico. Doesn't matter whether it's biro or pencil. You can, if you're feeling brave, use your water erasable pens, but they're expensive to buy, and the students will press on them, and so they won't last. Pencil really is best. Then you need to have pins, and pins with heads are good. It helps identify where the pin is visually, and it also gives people confidence. You need an assortment of buttons. I have a jar. 4-hole buttons are the best and not too small. That is it. Lastly, if you're feeling brave and bold and giving, you can just make up simple sets. And this is using all leftover cloths. Right, the first step. Hand these out to your left or right-handed students according to their dominant hands, and we're going to start looking at threading a needle. We call that the easier way. With threading a needle, the thread should be no longer than your arm, and I'm going to take the end, pinch it, and trim it sharply. Then in my non-dominant hand, looking for the needle I put aside earlier. Let's use this one. In my non-dominant hand, there it is. No. I'm going to put the thread between my first finger and my pointer, my second finger, my thumb and my forefinger, and lower with my dominant hand the needle eye onto the thread and push it through. This is undoubtedly the best way. You can get people who even have quite violent shakes to do this. Obviously, you don't want to give those people too small a head, and I'm demonstrating with a fairly large eye because I'm using a thick thread. So, lick, pinch, hands on a firm surface, put the needle over the top, pull the thread through evenly, and you know that it needs to pull back so that the thread can be let out as you stitch to between 1/2 and 1/3 of the full length of the thread. I cut that bit too long. Now we're going to look at how we hold the needle. You will find students will be so scared of this that they will hold the needle just with thumb and first finger, and that's pointless. It has no control. Looking at this, you'll start to analyze what you do, I think, which I hold my needle first and thumb and second finger, or big finger, nice and firm so I can control it. Then I put the thread between my last finger and my fourth finger, my ring finger, and that gives me a sort of control. It doesn't flap around on my palm and distract me, and it gives a sort of pressure. So, having done that, we now take our piece of calico and we're going to fold it up so the raw edges meet. And you're calling this an inner seam of a garment. So you could write, this is the inside of the cloth. And I've turned the cloth back on itself. Next, we're going to look at the fabric. So we've looked at the warp and weft. The question is, which is the right and wrong side of the cloth? So you can get your students, if you want, to do any form of design. This is the outside of the cloth. It's what you see. And the seams are on the inside of the cloth, aren't they? So we're going to write inside on this piece of fabric we've given, and we're going to fold the two edges together on the top, and imagine that the garment is inside out, because you're going to do your repair from the inside out. Take away my instructions. Take 2 pins, hold the pin in the dominant hand, hold the fabric in the helping hand, and from the bottom we're going to put these pins going vertically. Put the pin in, bend the cloth, and the pin goes up. Now this may seem a strange thing to have to learn from you, but just pinning is scary for people. They're always worried they're going to prick themselves, either with the needle or with the pin. And what you need to do is to encourage them to understand that by having this hand as the helping hand, they can control where the cloth goes and where the needle comes out, and it comes out over the nail on the thumb. Then we're going to get a line drawn about 1 centimetre from the edge, from each end, and that is going to represent our seam as it still sounds. This bit in the middle is a split, and that's where we want to mend. First of all, we're going to do some dots across here, and that's going to represent the stitches. So the stitches are going to be even as we can make them. Now we're going to take our thread and learn another technique. We don't recommend knotting. knotting is not consistent because it changes its ability to stick within the cloth according to the type of cloth, whereas this method is always secure. Just above the existing stitching line, a little way back because you don't want a hole, you put a tiny stitch, pull the thread through and leave a tail, which can be chopped off later, and go over that tiny stitch again and again. So the student is holding the needle in their dominant hand and the fabric in their helping hand. So depending, I'm right-handed, my right hand, my left hand is my helping, vice versa for the other way around. And go through, over 2, 3 times. Now our instructions have reversed the drawings so that people can feel more confident. You are sewers yourselves, so you know about backstitch, but this is where we start to stitch before the end of the split. Go back behind one and out in front. Behind the stitch and out in front. Now we're going to move on to the dots. So students learn about keeping the needle in one hand, no passing it to the back, no swapping because there's no control. In, bend the fabric, up and over the nail. Now, you're all sewers, so this is going to bore you. I'm going to go 2 more stitches. Students will carry on following their dots for a bit, and you specifically want the dots to stop because at some point they will start designing their own length. Generally speaking, if I get smaller and smaller and smaller, sometimes they're too tight and they loosen up, or the other way around. But what's going to happen next, and I'll just quickly get this finished off, so at the end you do a stay stitch, trim. Next we're going to learn another skill, which is the using of shears. I've taught students who are extremely clever and get very fussed when they can't use shears properly. So shears are flat along the bottom. The design is so that you can run the cloth on the table and you disturb it as little as possible to get an accurate cutting line. You can pull your fingers back on themselves in the base section, and you can push your thumb over the top, and that engages the shears. If you have the resources, it's good to have left-handed shears and right-handed shears to teach. So then you put your shears in the fold and slice upwards. Now we open it up, having removed the pins, and you can see what your stitches look like, which is what's important. So at this point, students can pull their stitches. Are they tight enough? Are they a bit loose? Are they big enough? Are they small enough? Did they gather the fabric? And then they'll make further alterations. So just to recap, your students have learned thread a needle, put in pins, about hand dominancy, they've learned backstitch, and they've learned how to use shears. Now we're going to do a hem. Actually, I'm going to put the pin back in here, just to keep it safe there. We're going to move the bottom of the cloth. This is still the inside of the cloth. So the idea is that you fold it up. The calico is lovely at that, it just pleats nicely. And pin along here. Our pins initially were vertical, now they're going to be horizontal. So it's the same principle, push the pin in, bend the cloth and out. But that it does require a slight rethink. Why am I doing it horizontally? And that's because you want to be able to stitch over them. Whereas with here, you were stitching between them. So you think about how you want to pin according to your stitches. This is the hem. So where's my pencil? This is the inside of the hem. In most industrially produced clothing now, this here would be overlocked. It'll be a raw edge that's overlocked. In couturier clothing and in old clothing, sometimes homemade clothing, there's a roll, but that's quite rare these days. When the stitching breaks, you haven't got anything to catch on. So what we learn is a herringbone stitch so that we can bind the two edges together. I'm going to put dots about 1 centimetre along the edge, one over the top of the raw edge there and one down on the inside, top down. That's where the stitches are going to be. It's very important at this point that you have your instructions for both left and right-handed, because it has the sewing direction. This is where the right-handers start on the left and work to the right, and the left-handers start on the right and work to the left. And there's great confusion without that image. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to start on the right. My thread's getting muddled. There we are. Firstly, you secure on the inside. 1, 2, 3. Oh, I know, we could just show this trick, which we'll look at buttons later. So before I secure the thread, I take it up between the layers, and that means that you don't have to see the edge of the thread there. Now I'm going to bend the cloth, take just a tiny piece of thread, bend the cloth again, put the needle in through both layers, pull it back till there's only one layer, and take one stitch. Tiny threads from the top, very small. And you may think that this is just impossibly difficult for students. It isn't. Somebody who's getting used to working with their hands in the right way will start to feel this. So you put the needle in, pull it back, click, listen, there. Take the thread. It's clever, and people gain confidence. Ooh, getting my pins caught. That happens, doesn't it? We all know that happens. Now, down again, and up, and so on. When they get to the bottom and they've finished the split, they can do a couple of stay stitches, take the thread into the inside, run it down between the two cloths, pull it back, trim. You'll find that students do very small stitches, get more loose, or vice versa, but they will change as they go along. Now we're going to move to the button. So we're going to fold this again as if it's a placket, and this time pin up the way down the way. Buttons are always sewn on multiple layers of cloth, so we're going to do exactly the same. If you're teaching somebody to put buttons on for the first time, they're not a machine sewer, so it won't be a garment that they've made from scratch normally, and so they're replacing a button. So what they need to do is look and see, imagine, is it a button that has parallel lines, or is it a button that has cross lines? Either way, the method is the same. They just need to make sure they copy what's there previously. If you're working in ordinary thread, then it's an awful lot of rotations or stitches around the button. You halve the number you need if you work with double thread, which many of you will prefer to do. Again, I'm going to demonstrate in the thick thread because it means everyone can see, and that's what I do when I'm teaching. Take the thread again in the double layers, bring it up to where you want to sew on the button, and there'll usually be a remnant. 1, 2, check it. Yeah, take it through to the front. Aim for one of the buttonholes. There. And cross, I'm going to do a cross one. Cross over and go back through the same place. Now attach it fairly loosely. It's very important that it's loose. In another way, and down, up again, through the button hole, go across and down. You all know how to sew on buttons. What I find is that I like to keep it loose, particularly loose if it's going to be a coat or something thick, but I can't use those picks or pins or whatever that they suggest. I can't do that at all. Just have to make it a bit loose. When you've done enough stitches, and honestly it doesn't need too many stitches to stay on, you then come up between the middle of the button and the lower layer of cloth and make a stem. So I love doing this. 1, 2, 3 for luck, and put the needle through the stem and then through the loop it makes. Do that as many times as you like. Take it to the back of the cloth. Made that a bit tight in the end, I think. You're right. There. One more stitch. Get rid of that. And then between the layers once again. No. So I want you to go between the layers. No. Travel down between the layers. Have I managed that? Cut. Have I managed to go between the layers? No. Oh well, look, it's here. I'll pull it back, trim. There we are. That's the button. When we said that you can mend the majority of your clothing with these stitches learned, what you've learned is to manipulate needles. Let's start again with another one. You've learned to manipulate needles, and this means that you are becoming a sewer. And with that, you can then apply your learning to the next stage. And on our instructions, we have a suggested learning for the next stage. So this is stage 1 of learning to mend clothes, and then we apply this to a second stage. With visible mending being very popular, one of the things that you must realize is that with this hand manipulation, people can now do a running stitch, but you can choose to practice that in any way you want. So it's simply having methodical up and down. There's so much made of sashiko stitching, and an awful lot of it can be very design-led and very beautiful, but it is just using a woven cloth. You can't do it with other things because it's non-stretchy running stitch. If you wanted, you could do some sort of pattern work like this. The last stitch we think is really important in mending clothes by hand is ladder stitch. And you will receive a sketch of ladder stitch. We're trying to work it to put it into our instructions, but we're still designing that at the moment. When you're preparing pieces, you could either make with a sewing machine your little piece with sewn seams and a gap, or you can pin them together. And you have to remember that this is the outer layer of cloth. The difference of this stitch, which we call ladder stitch, I think it can also be called mattress stitch, but that doesn't sound like it belongs to clothing, is that you are sewing a garment, you're making a seam in a garment, you can see I've used this before, where you cannot access the interior seam in any other way. I've saved many a coat and a lot of money with this stitch. My daughter's puffer jacket for school lasted another 3 years once I've mended this above the pockets. That's a lot of money. So, where the hole begins, you get in there. Actually, we'll go through, we'll start slightly differently. Again, we'll loose the thread. So we'll go through the double layers, but come up on the inside. I'll trim that later. Then you want to do a small stay stitch here. I'm going to shorten my thread because it's too long. There. Now I'm going to take my needle up to the top of this fold, and the folds will exist on whatever garment or item, toy or whatever, because that's the point. They were folded and seamed together, and now they are no longer. We're going to take the stitch from one fold to another with a 90 degrees line of thread. So this is quite a thick needle, it makes it quite difficult, but so along the lower top edge and 90 degrees crossover, travel the needle down in the inner seam of the top, cross and travel along the seam again, and the same here. So that's why it's called the ladder. And one of the nicest things to do is to pull it together at the end. Well, the end, after a little bit of stitching, and see what you do. See how invisible it becomes. There, not over pulled, but tight enough. When you get to the end of your gap, then you simply, which I'm going to go across and stitch properly before I do that there. Should have done that in the first place. So you seal it, you do your stay stitch where your last stitch is on the inside. 1, 2, 3, and then pop it inside the cloth again. And do it from the top so I can see what I'm doing. Underneath. Pull back on itself, trim, pull back on itself, trim. And that is your stem stitch. Your ladder stitch. So there we are. Now, with all of this knowledge is the stepping stone to sewing many things. And that's how people learn really properly and for life. So I hope you found that useful and thoughtful, and you can gain something from it. I just want to recap on the where you can find things on the website and next steps too. So I'll share the screen again. So we've covered core mending skills. And if we go back to the home page, you'll find the PDF downloads for teaching here, right and left-handed instructions. So that's what you can give out with your classes. They can be printed back to back and in black and white. As we've said, we're trying to put ladder stitch on that. And for mending tutorials, the next stage, you can go up to general mends, and there's heaps of ideas for cloth mending there. And uniform mends, most of what we've taught already can be applied, but you could get ideas of specific uniform problems from that. Beginners embroidery is for teaching very small children really how to start hand skills, so you'd want to do that to a different age group. And if you ever find anything is missing, tell us. Stop share. Don't forget that you don't need to sew everything. If you have problems with jackets, for instance, outdoor jackets, then use spinnaker tape. Microfibers, you're much better to adhese a split than you are to sew it. So let's hope that this is a beginning of something good for you. Perhaps you're already teaching, and we really want you to use our resources. And thank you for being interested.